the lab, if that's the type of interface that you have, or a radiology interface too. And so this information that you're seeing, these are all orders that have been placed for an individual patient over many, many different encounters. And so therefore, the orders module and the interfaces that you have are responsible or can be responsible for both orders and results. So that's why we have it divided up into two sections. And of course, depending on who you're interfacing with or how that interface is going to go, you may have both orders and results, or you may just have the results coming back through. And in terms of placing a new order, it is important to keep in mind that the orders module actually supports both lab and radiology orders, and all of the setup from file maintenance has to be done in order for you to be able to use the order module as well. So when we get into that file maintenance piece, it's directly going to affect any orders that you're going to create. There is still some setup that needs to be done if you're going to be results only, but majority of it is on the ordering side. So this is the screen that you see here, and this is basically your new order screen. And it can be used by one person to do the entire process, or it can be broken out into multiple different people. However your workflow might need it to be, you can kind of have different steps throughout creating a new order. The screen that you're looking at now, this would be something more commonly used by the providers. And let me get a better list going here. There we go. So the providers themselves would be able to choose the diagnosis, and they can choose the tests that they'd like to order. They can also check medical necessity right from here. The other options are down in the bottom left corner, and you can choose the General tab, which would be allowing you to create or basically complete general information about the order itself. And the third tab over, which is the test details, which is specifically to create information about the individual tests. So the General tab could be done by one person, Select Test could be done by another, and Test Details again by another. Or, of course, all three could be performed by one person. So depending on your workflow, it is capable of breaking things up into various steps. So before we get into the actual setup of it, which is really the majority of what we're going to be doing today, I also want to stress one point with you guys. At this point in time, the orders module can be used independently of any templates. You can use all of your file maintenance setup and begin using the orders module right away. As soon as everything with your interface is done and everything like that, you really are ready to go. However, there is a template component to this, and it's not really that the templates are associated with the orders module, but if you have the 7.9 KBM, you can use the lab templates, or places where you would order labs. You can use those with the order module. So at this point in time, our WebEx is only going to cover the orders module. We won't be covering the lab template piece of it, but I just wanted you guys to have that in your brain, that the template is a possibility, and depending on if you've already had your core group training or if you're already live, you may already know about those templates, so you may be able to incorporate that piece of it into your workflow as well, but we'll be talking about it specifically from the order module perspective. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and first start with System Administrator. And there's very little setup that you need to do with System Administrator. There are a few things that you need to do with security rights, and there are a couple of things through universal preferences as well. The security rights, of course, if you access your group and then you click on rights, there are a couple rights under the modules and a couple under operations. First, what you're going to see is that specifically there are many file maintenance tables for the order module. So under the file maintenance security rights section, you want to make sure anything with the word order in it, like these here, has the proper security rights for the people that will be involved in the setup. Those people could be completely new people from what had been done previously in file maintenance, so that's why you want to be sure that you have all the right people accessing what they're able to, what they need to access. And also keep in mind as well, anything that's under the modules, security rights, those are going to be view, add, update, delete, and print. So you have to set all 5 for each security right. Further down the list, you also have something under medical records, which is the place where you're going to access our modules and main documentation places. Here you're going to specifically find the security rights for the orders module itself. And this again, view, add, update, delete, and print. This will directly set the access to the orders module. So this is probably the most important security right that you have in order to make sure anybody who needs to access this module is able to in the proper way. Now, further down, you're also going to notice one called the Rosetta Holding Tank. That's an application that we will be discussing today. That's also one that you need to set for anybody who might be involved in the lab process. Typically, and once we learn the application, it might make a little bit more sense, but typically you're going to have some lab, if you have lab users, they would need access to this. Nurses and MAs would need access to this. Providers can have access to this, however, they don't typically use this application. So more or less your clinical users are okay with having access to the Rosetta Holding Tank. Now further down, those are the ones under modules. If you go to operations now, we're again setting security rights for just yes and no. We do have a few items farther down under the order section. There's one specifically called order results sign-off, and this means here that the providers can actually sign off on the actual lab results. So you want to make sure that the proper people have access to sign off, and those who are not allowed to sign off don't have access. You also have under this orders section an option for providers to modify test favorites. And we'll get to this part throughout the file maintenance piece, but you'll notice that there's a practice level test favorites and a specialty level test favorites, but this security right setting will allow providers to also maintain their own favorites. And then the third application that we'll be talking about today again is the order management console. And that particular application is something that most likely just an IT person or maybe some of the administrators or managers and things like that, your basic clinical users do not need access to the order management console. It's something that will assist you with your setup initially with your lab, and it's not something you're going to have to be running daily or anything like that. So those are your security rights settings. Before I do that, let me check the questions here. Okay, there is a question on the chat board that was asking back when I was talking about the KBM templates. If you have any KBM lower than 7.9, you can utilize your templates with the orders module, but it requires a significant amount of template development. And for those of you that are in that situation, we have a separate webinar out there. After you complete this one, then you can go on to, it's called the 5-6 Lab Template Development. And so it'll tell you all the steps that are needed to customize your lab template in order to use it with the order module. But I do have to warn you, it's not just a little bit of development. It's, in some cases, taken people up to 80 hours of customization. And usually I say between 40 and 80 hours. So it's something to really consider if you need it or not, because you can use the orders module independently of the templates. And that again is if you're below the 7.9 KBM. If you currently have 7.9, then your templates are not going to need the customization out of the box that everyone else will. All right. So I just want to point out a couple things under universal preferences here. There's nothing that you specifically have to set up, but there is an interface holding tank section, which deals with your Rosetta holding tank. And mostly it's to do with tasking and things like that. Basically, a good way to put this is when results come back into the system, it can automatically send a task to a user to let them know that they have new results, or they can send the results to the PAQ and they can receive their notification that way. So in this particular section, this lets you decide if you want to have those tasks or not. For example, do I want to notify the holding tank user? So the person that's logged into the holding tank that's actually dealing with some of the results, do you want them to be notified through a task? I have mine set to false, which means no, they will not. You can also notify the ordering creator, which is oftentimes the provider, but not always. It could be a nurse that created the order and things like that. And you also can notify the ordering provider, which is the one that I have set to true. And that means, again, it's going to task. This is different than what goes to the PAQ. So those are some of the things that you might want to set up with your notifications. You also have a lab group section on the left. And this is as if you were not using the Rosetta holding tank. Same idea. Do you want to have tasks, and who do you want to notify? So it's got a notify lab ordering creator, same as before, notify lab ordering provider, or notify logged in user. So it's a little bit like what we had before. Typically, we notify the ordering provider. That way, if somebody else or another user creates the order for them, meaning they're just the ones that inputted it into EHR, the results still return to the right person. So those are your main items here. You can also do things like require the collection date and time. If you turn this particular option off, use simple lab notification, that'll take away your tasking. So right now I've got mine set to true, so I do receive tasks upon results, but you can turn that off so that it would just simply go to the PAQ instead of to the tasking. And more or less, that's all you're going to have to do for your orders module for system administrator. Couple security rights and a couple universal preference settings. So the majority of what you're going to set up is in file maintenance. So we're going to spend a good amount of time here. Let me check my chat board before I go on to that. Okay, and I do want to point out too, I know that I wasn't able to get the documentation to everybody, but there is documentation that goes along with the orders module. There is documentation on nextgen.com that you can download, but I also had sent an email to the person who'd registered for the WebEx, and I know specifically one email got returned to me and another person registered just this morning, so I didn't have a chance to get everybody's information out. But if you are needing that documentation from me, please also send me a chat message. Maybe if you didn't get it from me the first time, or if you know you registered today or something like that, send me a chat message with your email address and I'll be happy to forward the documentation to you. Okay, so now we're here in file maintenance, and where I'm going to access all of our order module tables are through the master files under system, and you specifically want to go through EHR. And the majority of the tables have the word order listed with them. So all these tables right here are specifically the ones that we're going to use. But there's also a section for orders under practices. There's a piece of it under payers, and there's a piece under specialties. So some tables that are existing for other reasons also have order module options. And what I want to do here is I'm not going to go through every table in order because some of these tables are going to be required, some of them are going to be completely optional. So I do want you to see exactly which items are the most important, and then we'll conclude it with things that are not. All right, so starting here with the order tests. This particular table is your #1 most important table. This contains your vendor, what we call the vendor compendium. And when you look at my list here, my vendor for the most part is LabCorp. But if you're interfaced with LabCorp, with Quest, with your hospital system, or with a radiology company as well, those all have specific codes that go along with their tests. If it's labs, those are not CPT codes. Those are their individual test codes that they use to place orders. And if it's radiology, then it's going to be CPT codes for those particular items. But what's basically going to happen is the vendors that you're interfaced with will provide you a spreadsheet with all of their codes. And if you have more than one vendor, you will need to have more than one spreadsheet. So you'll need your LabCorp codes, for example, and your Quest codes. And more or less, the spreadsheet they give you is going to have, usually it has your most commonly ordered test first, and it kind of goes from order of importance down from there. But they may still give it to you alphabetically, things like that. But the bottom line is you need a spreadsheet from the vendor that contains all of the tests that you are going to need to order. And that spreadsheet is then taken by your next-gen interface analyst, and they can load that compendium for you into this table. So, of course, when you see my list of LabCorp tests, you can see it's very, very long. And you don't have to add these tests manually one by one. They get added through the interface analyst. Also, at the end of the session, when we talk about the orders management console, that's another way that they can get loaded for you. So, but the bottom line is, every single vendor where you have an interface is going to need to have their test codes loaded into this table. That's why it's the most important. And technically speaking, you cannot use the orders module without the information in this table. When you look at an individual test, if I were to go to create a new one, just to show you what was needed, there are 5 required fields. And these are the fields that get completed when the interface analyst loads the compendium for you. So they will choose the system, which is the vendor. So if I were to be adding Quest, then I would have to choose Quest Diagnostics here. The key is the code in which Quest needs to have the test listed by. So it's their independent code. The description is the name of the test. So that would be typed there. The code system is something that we use. Our interface uses this information to identify the vendor. And usually it's just a single letter. It's kind of a match to the system. So for example, Q for Quest, L for LabCorp. We've done H for Harvest or Orchard. So there's different types of code systems out there. And then the order type, whether it's a lab order or a radiology order. So if I'm talking Quest, it's going to be a lab order. So those 5 required fields are what actually creates the test for you. So you have to have those. The rest of the information on this tab and the 2 other tabs are going to be optional depending on the vendor and depending on what you choose to do with the system. So keep in mind, outside of these 5 required fields, everything else that you see in here, you may have to complete that manually on your own. So that loading in that compendium only takes care of these 5 required fields. The rest of the information that we have is all kind of, like I said, situational. So I'm going to go through each one. The first thing is the next-gen compendium test key. And what I want to do before I go into that is I want to go out of this table and I want to show you that we have another table called the Order Next-Gen Test Compendium. So we were previously in Order Tests. Now we're going to the Next-Gen Test Compendium. This is a preloaded list from NextGen. And if you don't have it loaded for some reason, you can actually have your interface analyst load this too. But the deal is, this is NextGen's lists of tests. And more or less, we have this in here so that you can link your vendor test to the NextGen test and create kind of a universal list. This particular list is very important if you plan on using the 7.9 KBM template and place orders that way through the module. It's also very important if you have multiple vendors that you're interfaced with. It's not a required field or a required table to do. It's also not required for you to link it to your vendors, but it is required if you're going to have either of those 2 situations I just mentioned. So before we go back into the order tests, I do want to stress here, this is a preloaded list from NextGen. If you click the Norton button, you cannot create new tests. This is a list that we control, we add to it. If you are worried that you don't have the most recent version, maybe you have had NextGen for a really long time and you don't know that you have the most recent compendium, you can let your interface analyst know and they can load the most recent version for you. but you cannot actually add to this. What you can do, you can open up a test, and you are able to create a user description, and you can mark the test as confidential. The regular description is the one that we put in. The user description can be a name that your practice actually identifies it by instead of by the test description. Confidential means that if results return for this particular test, the providers will be allowed to see the results, but nobody else will. Confidential means you have to be assigned to a provider with a relationship of self through system administrator, and then you can see the confidential results. So those two things you can modify. I also want to point out, too, that we have based our compendium off of the LabCorp compendium. So if you use LabCorp as one of your vendors, you will notice the test key is exactly the same as the LabCorp test key, except for we add NG to it, and the name or the description will be exactly the same too. Any other vendor, it's of course going to be a little bit different. So when you go back to the order test table, your goal here is to take a vendor test and link it to a next-gen compendium test. So if I chose this Billy Rubin total here, open that up. I've already done the linking because I've obviously done this many times here, but you can see that my goal is to click this yellow folder, and I want to link my next-gen Billy Rubin total to the test that I'm in here. And again, the reason I'm doing this is because I wish to place an order from the 7.9 lab template, or I have multiple vendors that I work with, and instead of having multiple vendors listed and having all these different tests separated out by vendor, I'm linking them together to the next-gen test so that I can create a universal test list. So again, those two situations are the reasons you're going to do this here. And the reason why I brought up the fact that we base this off of LabCorp is because you can see my LabCorp code is 001099. My next-gen code is NG001099. So it's the same code plus the NG. So if you're a LabCorp customer, you're going to have an easier time linking. Not that it's going to be difficult for everybody else, but that you're going to be able to match code to code. So it'll be a little bit easier. The rest of you that don't have LabCorp, it won't be difficult to do, but I do recommend instead of going off of the key to go off of the description. So if you were needing to look up Billy Rubin, you would just type in Billy Rubin instead. So either way you do it, it's still going to be able to find the code that you need. It's just that LabCorp will have the exact code in here. So then that takes us to, let me check the chat board here, that takes us to the CPT codes and the cost. And the CPT code is needed if you're going to be utilizing the medical necessity feature with the orders module. That's actually a separate webinar as well, and it's actually a separate utility and license altogether. But if you do choose to use medical necessity with the orders module, it can't use it without the CPT code for the test. So this one is something that you're also going to have to do manually. You're going to need to click this yellow folder, and then you're going to need to look up the CPT code for that test. So you can look it up by code, or you can click on description and look it up that way, either one. So if you were to type in here Billy Rubin, for example, then you'll be able to find your code as needed and move that over. And again, that code is used so that the medical necessity check can look at the CPT code and compare it to the diagnosis code being used. So that's all you have to do is you just do a one-to-one match on the CPT code for each test. And again, that's mostly a manual process. When we get to the orders management console at the end, I will show you a way that might be able to work for you to download it from there, but it won't work for everybody. So your lab test details tab is mostly going to be the 5 required fields, but most of you are going to link the next-gen compendium. Even though it's optional, I highly recommend doing it. The CPT code, however, is only if you're going to be doing the medical necessity piece. Oh, and I didn't mention down here, the cost is also for medical necessity. There's an ABN form that can be printed and used. So you need to input the cost of the test so that the ABN form has that indicated on it. So if it was, for example, $50, you can put that in there. Otherwise, the other two fields here you don't need to worry about. Days to expect results is not currently being used by this version, so you don't have to fill anything out with that. And the notes are something that you can put internal to yourself or to your practice, but it'll never show in the orders module. It'll really never show outside of this particular entry in the table. So it's just an internal message. The next tab over, which is specimen handling, this is also a completely optional section. And what you can do is, again, I'm talking about a bilirubin total test. I can say what the specimen information is for this one particular test. So you can put things like minimum volume, suggested volume, the container that's used to store it, and also how it might be stored, like room temperature, refrigerated, things like that. So you can indicate this, but what it does for the user in the order module is it just gives them a reference for what they need to complete when they're placing the order. And actually, let me show you this in the module really quick. If you have a test that requires, let's see, this one might have it. Here is the specimen information section of an order. Notice there's nothing in these individual boxes, but if you click on the blue link, it says click to display specimen handling details. Nope, I don't think I have any in most of these here, but you'll be able to see what I put in file maintenance in this section. So whatever I complete here shows back in this screen. So it doesn't fill out anything or default anything, and it doesn't actually reference it directly on the same screen, but at least they can pull this up in a pop-up and they can use the information if they need to. But what I do typically tell everybody is that if your users who are collecting the specimen, if they already know what the specimen information is and what is expected of that specimen, then you don't really need to worry about this part. It's probably in that case just the extra steps that you don't need to fill out. But if you have users that collect a specimen that need this guidance, then you definitely want to fill this out for tests. And, they're just free text for filling things out. So you can say whatever you need to say, whatever is expected by the lab, you can type that in there. And your final tab, this is going to take us into a couple other tables. But first of all, you're going to skip the updated workflow task items. That particular piece is not being used anymore either. But the tabs or the sections for ask it order entry questions and components, those may be used. And so before I go into those, I want to recap really quick. And again, let's talk about the two tables that we've discussed so far. The order tests is your number one most important table here. You're going to load your vendor compendiums into this list. And then what we were just previously doing is you might modify those individual tests with additional information. You're also going to utilize the next-gen test compendium, and you're going to use this to link your vendor compendium to each code. And by the way, I don't think I really mentioned this before. Since you might have multiple vendors, you need to link every single test for each vendor. So even if you've done the lipid panel for LabCorp, you need to go and do the lipid panel for Quest as well. So each test has to be linked to the next-gen compendium for it to be all one universal list. So back to the order tests when we were talking about ask it order entry questions. This is basically another piece of information that the lab is going to provide for you. On the spreadsheet they give you that has all the tests, they should also have a section of that that requires all the questions that they need to have answered before they can complete a test. Usually those kind of questions are, is the patient fasting? What's the source of a specimen? The patient's race? LMP? Their height or weight? Those kind of things, even total volume of the specimen. Those are the kind of things that the lab will need to know before they can actually perform the test or receive the results. And so therefore, they're going to give you those questions. They're also going to possibly give you acceptable answers for those. For example, patient's race, they're going to give you possible answers that their system will identify. Also, if it's something like source, they might give you a list of places where a specimen might come from. But if it's other things like LMP or height or weight, they're not going to give you possible answers because those are going to be dependent on the patient. So you'll see those two options in there. And so you're going to utilize that list to create this next section. So there's going to be a component in the order AOE answers table, also order AOE questions, and then we link them back to order tests. So again, I have to advise you to look at your spreadsheet for this information. And I can tell you, I've worked with a few clients in the past that have had trouble deciphering what the spreadsheets have. And if you are having a situation where the spreadsheets aren't making sense, you can ask your lab if they can decipher a little bit. You can also ask your next-gen interface analyst, or you can ask an EHR trainer like myself, and we can help you decipher that information for you. So let's start with our questions, order AOE questions. These are the ones, like I said, is the patient fasting, what's the source of the specimen, what is the patient's LMP. So those are your questions, and these are all example questions that I have in my database. Honestly, there's probably going to be maybe 10 to 15 questions. There's not a whole lot out there that they might need to ask. And you might have different things based on different parts of the country. Different lab vendors are going to ask different things. But what your goal is here is to just create the questions. At this point in time, they have nothing to do with an individual test. You're just creating the question. So what I do want to stress is that your spreadsheet might, for example, list fasting 10 different times. And that's because maybe 10 different tests require that you ask if the patient is fasting. But you only have to create the question one time. So you'll create the question once, link it to the 10 tests. So when you see this list, it might look longer than it actually is. When you go to create a question, this is what you're going to need to do. There are a few required fields. First and foremost, you always have to add the system. You have to identify the vendor for this particular question. So if we're talking LabCorp, that's the one you would choose there. The code and the description are specifically going to come from the vendor's spreadsheet. And this is where it can get tricky. I know specifically on LabCorp, they tend to list the test code, then the test description, then they list, they list the question code, and then the question description. And I was recently working with somebody who got those columns mixed up, and they created the question with the wrong code and description. So I want to be clear, the question code and the question description go here. For LabCorp, if we're talking about fasting, honestly their code is just this. It's FASTIN. So it's just a simple abbreviation for fasting. And their question, I think it just says fasting flag is what they ask for. So it depends on what your spreadsheet says and your individual vendor, but it'll be something like that. It's possible that a vendor, instead of having a code like this, they could have numbers. So be on the lookout for that, but make sure it's the question code and question description, not the test code. That's where you might be able to ask your vendor what information you see on the spreadsheet. Say, maybe what's in column A, what's in column B, C, and D. So just ask them that. They're not going to be able to tell you where to put it in NextGen, but at least they can tell you on their spreadsheet, this is what you're looking at. So I'm going to stick with fasting real quick. Then your next required field is the source type. And the source type actually means where is the answer going to come from. So we've asked our question, which is for if the patient is fasting, how do we answer yes or no? Your choices are free text, which means you don't have to do anything else. You're just going to free text in yes or free text no, or at the time the order is placed. You can create a pick list, and if you do so, the pick list opens up AOE answer, and it actually requires that you backtrack out to a completely different table called order AOE answers, and you can build a pick list there, so we'll come back to that. Or you can do a template. And if the information that you're trying to find for this question has been completed in a template somewhere else in an encounter, then you can actually pull that information in from that template. And an example of this might be LMP. So if I put in code LMP, put in last menstrual period, the template where we collect this information in NextGen, I just know from experience, it's called ROS_GYN. So that's the template I want to find. So I review a system's GYN template. So I choose that template, and the field is called LMP. So for those of you that are somewhat familiar with Template Editor, or if you know how to find out field names, this option will work pretty well for you. And if they've already asked the patient their LMP for the day, there's no need to ask it again. So you can pull it in. Same is true for their height or their weight. Those are on the vital signs templates. You might even have templates for some of this other information. I know a lot of times the PAP source is done on a template. So you can pull anything in from a template that you want to. You just have to know how to find the name of the template and the field name in order to link it here. So those are your three source types. Free text is the easiest one. You're not going to really do anything else with that. Pick list, you have to build a previous list on the order AOE answers table. And template, you have to find out the template name and field name for that data. From there, let's see, you really can skip this field here. The native data type, that's not something that you have to mess with. But with the units, some of your questions are going to have units, like a total volume or something like that, or height or weight. You might want to put if it's inches or feet or pounds or kilograms or whatever the case may be. Also in units, sometimes people use this one to indicate formatting. Like I just recently was working with a client that did LabCorp, and their LMP, of course, is a date, but they wanted it to be year, month, day, and NextGen does it in month, day, year. So in the units, they did this, year, month, day, so that you at least knew the formatting, and they used a free text option so that they could just type in the date as they needed to. Also, you need to put in the NextGen data type. These are the ways that the information is going to be formatted through NextGen. There's a numeric field. If it's anything like height or weight is numeric. If it's a date, like LMP, you can do that. However, date is automatically formatted month, day, and year, so that would have to be able to work with the system. You can combine date and time, and you can actually do time separate by itself as well. String is like a string of characters, so it'd actually be text, might be a better way to describe it. String is where you're just going to type in an answer. It can have letters, numbers, punctuation. It doesn't matter. You can have all of it. Boolean is a yes or a no option. So in our fasting option, that would be what we would choose here, because that's a yes or a no. And then integers being different numbers, bigger numbers, different formatted numbers than numeric. So you want to pick your data type. Of course, you're mostly going to stick with string and date and numeric. Those are your most common ones. But you want to get the formatting so that the system is recognizing what type of information you're going to put in there. Then you're going to want to choose these two checkboxes potentially. The first one is called Ask Question Once. And that means a question like LMP, for example, is the same answer regardless of the test. Same with fasting, same with patient's height or weight. Those are the kind of things that you only need to ask the question one time per order, even if it's required for all 5 tests. So you can decide that by question. There's going to be things like the source, for example, might not be able to be asked once because you might have a specimen from their blood, you might have urine, you might have a tissue sample, so it all just kind of depends on the answer to the question. You also can decide if the answer is required, and therefore you cannot place the order and send it to the lab without an answer to this question. And that's kind of more going to be up to the vendor than you guys. But, you know, when in doubt, you can make it required so that you can make sure the information is sent properly. But the lab will tell you if they need the answer as a requirement to performing the test. If they don't need the answer, I guess then you can uncheck that box. So that's how you create your question. And again, you're going to have somewhere between about 10 to 15 questions depending on the vendor, and they're going to give you their questions in their spreadsheet. So your main table is going to be order AOE questions, but remember I was telling you too that in your spreadsheets, they sometimes will list possible answers. And possible answers are what allow you to create a pick list out of certain items. So I gave the example of patient race, of the source. Gosh, I guess if there's anything else that I can't really think of necessarily that many others. Maybe the PAP source as well. I think I've got a couple other examples in here. Heritage, blood lead county, that kind of stuff. So all of these kind of things had possible answers. So instead of free texting, you want to create a pick list so that the user picks one of the possible answers. So in that case, when they give you possible answers for the question, you have to build the AOE answers table first, and then you go to questions. But, like I said, if you have 10 to 15 tests, maybe 5 to 8 of them are going to have possible answers. The rest might be free text or templates. So when you go to build this, it's actually very easy. I'm going to create a new one, and there's only 3 required fields. You definitely have to pick your vendor. So if I pick LabCorp again, that's my vendor. And the code and the description will match the code and the description for the question. So already what we talked about, you look at your spreadsheet and you find out your question code and your question description. So if we're talking fasting, that's what we needed here. Then this little Norton button is how we're going to create our pick list entries. So when I click new, it's going to give me a value box, and I'm going to type yes. And then maybe I'll do next, so I can click no. And that's probably all I need is just yes and no. So I create my list that way. If I show you some of my other examples, here's ones that have more options. We created a pick list out of this because these are the format and the exact wording for how the lab wants to receive this information. Might also be something like Heritage, for example, is one of the new options specifically for meaningful use. So that might be in there. PAP source, too. So you can see that listed there. Other things, so they might potentially, like gender, for example. Yeah, you can make a pick list out of gender, but you could also link it to a template because you know that the gender is already captured in the templates. So some of the times when they give you possible answers, you actually might be able to avoid the whole pick list option and let the answer just be completed for them from the template. So again, if you get possible answers, you have to create those first. Then you're going to go to order AOE questions. And here's an example of one that uses a pick list. You put in the question code, the question description, and then you're going to choose pick list as the source type, and then you pull in the pick list that you just created from the answer table. So that's why you have to do it first because it's actually linked to it. And also notice if you do try to create a new one with a pick list, let me get this in here. AOE answer is required. So you can't fill this table out part of the way and then come back to it. It's a required field. Make sure I don't have any chat questions. Please remember again, if you guys do have questions, just to let me know. And make sure I'm getting to everybody's. Okay. So those are probably the 4 required tables. Order test, next-gen test compendium, order AOE questions, and order AOE answers. Oh, you know what? Let me go back really quick to the order test table. Let me go to that Bilirubin test that we were already talking about. Once I have created my question, then I need to go back to the test, which we'll say it's this, well, we'll say it's this one right here. Then you go to the options, and here you link the question to the test. And And this part's really important too because the order module will not know to ask the question unless it's already linked to a specific test. So when you click on this yellow folder, you're going to go ahead and choose the question. So let's say they need fasting and they need LMP and it needs source or something like that. So those three questions are asked for this one particular test. That's what I've indicated here. So now that you have that and you click OK, the test is linked to the question. So that's what I was saying before. You only have to create the question once and then you link it to each test. Fasting and source are asked on many, many different tests. All right, so let's move forward. Oops, I see a question real quick. Let me see. Somebody had a question that you couldn't delete or hide in the AOE answers. You should be able to hide okay. Was there something, you might have to be more specific with your question, was there something specific you were trying to hide? You can't delete in file maintenance, but you can hide. So I guess I'll have to see what you're looking for. Okay, and while I'm waiting for that, we'll go ahead and move forward. Oh, you said you created Y for yes, then decided to use yes, now cannot delete Y. Well, let's test your thing here. So, you decided to do Y, and then you wanted to go back. So, did you notice that pop up there? Did you already save the screen? You might want to click OK and go back to it and see if you can modify it. You should just be able to type in yes in place of it, or whatever you needed it to be. So you don't necessarily have to delete it, but you can modify it. Okay. So the next section that we're going to talk about is, now we're starting with the optional stuff. So the order components table right here, this is really not necessary to complete if we're just talking about a lab interface. When you receive results from a lab interface, the tests are going to come back with their individual components listed automatically. And when that's the case, you will see it in the order module, and you'll see, for example, the test listed in gray, and then each individual component right below it. So they automatically send those back to you. So there is a table that's kind of a placeholder for components, but you don't have to fill that out because the results interface is not dependent on that. But what we do tend to use order components for is sometimes people like to include some of their in-house labs in the orders module. And I want to be clear about this part because the in-house labs don't mean that you have to do every single in-office test through the orders module, but there might be some tests that it would be beneficial to have their results incorporated into this list too. So for example, a urinalysis does not need to be done through the orders module. We have a template for that, and you can put the results right in the template where they need to see that. But maybe a hemoglobin A1C, that might be a test that they would like to compare with other tests, or they might want to be able to track past results and things like that. So a hemoglobin A1C would be a good test to put here. So if that's the case, first of all, you're not going to have your in-house tests automatically loaded. So you will have to go to the order test table, and you will have to manually create in-house labs. And I've got 4. I've got a CBC, hemoglobin, lipid panel, and hemoglobin A1C. So here's my example of hemoglobin A1C. What I've done is completed the first 5 required fields. The system is called in-house lab. It's not a vendor that you're interfaced with. It's just a vendor that's in the list to indicate that you're doing them in your office. I created a key that I made up myself. I just abbreviated hemoglobin A1C. And I, of course, typed the description for myself. The code system will be I for in-house, and the order type was lab. And I did go ahead and link it to my next-gen compendium, just in case I had any outside hemoglobin A1Cs. It'll combine them into one test instead of seeing LabCorp separate from in-house lab. But I didn't really do anything else. I didn't do any specimen handling. There were not any ask it order entry questions. The only thing I had to do was the components piece. So again, you create your test, and then you actually have to go to your order components table, and you have to create those components. And I've got, again, many, many examples in here, but all of these are my in-house labs. Here is one for hemoglobin A1C. Some of these might be for a CBC. They might be for a lipid panel. So it all depends on the individual test. But basically, when you create your component, it's looking for the same system that you chose in the test, which is in-house lab, a key and a description, which you make up for yourself, and code system, which is I for in-house. And then it's a good idea to have the units of the test and the reference range for the normal values. So if it's normal from 0 to 7, for example, then you would want to put that in your reference range. And then once you've created that component, you'll keep going per test. You know, if it's a CBC or some type of a panel, then it's going to have lots of components for one test. So you'll create all the components for one test, kind of like I did here. Then you'll go back to your order test table, and you'll link that component to the test. So I've got hemoglobin A1C for my in-house vendor. I go to options, and you can see I've linked my hemoglobin A1C component right here. If it were the lipid panel, I've got components here. I can link in, let's see, HDL, LDL, cholesterol, and triglycerides, so those kind of things. So you pick the components that go with that test, and then when you click OK, they're now linked. So again, you only have to do the order components table for your in-house labs, and you only have to do certain labs that you want incorporated into the orders module. Don't waste your time putting things like urinalysis, rapid strep, pregnancy tests, things like that, because those are going to just be on-the-fly tests that they need to see that day. They're probably not going to be worried about seeing past tests in those cases. So you just need to make sure that you do the ones that are important. And I think in terms of our recommendation, we usually just say hemoglobin A1C. So it's not really something to fret over. Check my questions here. I guess your question stating back to the order AOE answers, we might have to talk about that offline. Since we've got multiple clients on here, I'm not able to really look at your system or help with anything specific to you, but maybe we can address this afterwards. Okay, so moving on down the list, the next table that you have is called the order test favorites. And this is a really great table to create if you're going to utilize the order module to place the order. Remember, you have the option of using your lab template in the KBM. So if that's going to be the case, you don't need to do this table. But the order test favorites is a way for you to create a list either by practice or by specialty or by provider for all of the test favorites. I recommend at least having it by practice, so that everybody can have kind of a basis to go off of when ordering tests. But if you're a multi-specialty group, that might help you to have family practice, peds, OBGYN, whatever specialties you might have, you might want to do that. And that's really probably all you need. The provider list is good if you think that you have providers that are actually going to have different tests from another provider, but sometimes just doing specialty or practice is enough. What you're basically going to have to do, though, is you're going to need to create a list of favorites. And I've created a bunch over time. I've got one called practice favorites. I've got OBGYN favorites. I have family practice favorites. Maybe I can do one that's a specialty. So if I go to create a new one, you need to either choose your system, which is your vendor, or you can make it a next-gen compendium favorite, which means if it's by NextGen Compendium, it doesn't matter what vendor you use, it'll automatically still do this favorites list. And that can be good when you use multiple vendors because the providers don't often know which vendor to choose. That's usually done later in the process. So you can create a compendium favorites list so that they always see that information. And when you go to create that list, you're also going to need to choose your order type so it distinguishes between lab and radiology. And then you give it a description. So let's call it gastro favorites. And then all you're going to do is simply use the yellow folder, and you're going to choose the tests from your vendor compendium or from the NextGen compendium and add them to the favorites. So here I'll just do a search for all tests, and I'll just move over the top few. But you just add the tests that you need so that you can now have your favorites list. And you can see you can really easily just add any test, but you can also search for a test. Here's that bilirubin that I've been using, and you can use that to move it over. So those are definitely a worthwhile thing for you to do, is to create these test favorites. Let me get a better example in here real quick. I'll do this bilirubin. Maybe I'll do a lipid panel. We'll do TSH. So I'll add some real tests in here. And we'll do a CBC. So again, let me get a better CBC in there. Once you have your test determined here, you've created a list of favorites. So I called these gastro favorites. Remember, I've also got a practice favorites, OBGYN, family practice. So at this stage of the game, you're creating your practice level or your specialty level favorites only. The provider level favorites are done a little bit of a different way. So I'm going to go ahead and take my practice favorites and link them to my practice, and then I'm going to take my specialty favorites and link them to the specialty that they belong to. So you actually need to exit the order test favorites table, and then in this case I'd go to practices, and I'll pick one of these practices here, go to preferences, and then you're going to go to the order module section of practice preferences. And I've already done these, so let me remove these really quick. But basically this bottom section of your order module section is where you're going to link the test favorites for the practice. So when you click the yellow folder, it's now accessing the order test favorites table. And remember, I had one called practice favorites, so I can pull that over. Maybe I also have radiology favorites. Notice that I've got LabCorp in here and NextGen. So maybe I have a LabCorp favorites and a NextGen compendium favorites. So you can have two different ones for labs as long as they're different vendors. Same with radiology if they're different vendors, NextGen or the vendor or multiple vendors. So by having these three listed here, I now have practice level favorites. I'm going to put these sample ones in here. So that's pretty easy to do. You just need to determine what your practice needs, or what in the next case your specialties would need for their individual test favorites. The number is unlimited. You can do as many favorites as you want. Just keep in mind all of your favorites are going to take up this middle section here when you create a new order. So when I look at, let's do a category really quick. Here's a list that has about 8 tests on it. Some might have 2, some might have 100. Here's a NextGen compendium favorites that I can show you too. I'll do it on a new one real quick. So here's a bigger list. So you can do as many tests as you want. It'll create a checkbox for each one, and it'll automatically do a scroll bar if you need to as well. So you can have as many tests as you want. So again, I'm going to come back to the rest of the practice preferences, but let me show you how to do the specialty really quick. So you click on the specialties table. It's in the 4th column over. And I created gastro, so let me go to gastroenterology. And there's a test favorite section here. going to click on the yellow folder, and then I'm going to find my gastro favorites, move that over to the right, and now that specialty has favorites. And what I want to stress about the specialties is that while technically in the orders module, we refer to them as categories. So when you see this button here called by category, this is where you see your favorites. See, it already included gastroenterology with the 4 tests that I just added. So you'll also notice I can see every specialty that I've linked favorites to. So the provider doesn't have to be linked to a specialty to use this. You don't have to have any specialty set in the encounter or anything like that. It's just that you're creating categories out of those specialties so that you can automatically access them. So it might even be beneficial for your family practice providers to use the OBGYN favorites or something like that. So that's why you will see all of these. So in order for me to do the 3rd level of test favorites, that's the provider level, it's actually going to be based off of the practice level list. And when you go back to your practice preferences, there's a checkbox under order module that says here, allow providers to maintain test favorites. So what happens is they take the base list from your practice, and then they can modify that list further by adding or deleting tests, and they can make it their own. So if you notice here, so I've got my list of favorites, but I have an add to favorites and a delete from favorites button. So if I find a new test, so I'm going to go ahead and use a better list here. So we'll do these 2. And I'm going to search for a lipid panel. And we'll go through all of this stuff in more detail in a minute. But I'm going to search for a new test. And I'm going to do this lipid panel and add it to my favorites. So I've added a new test to today's order, but I can also add that to my favorites. So when I'm looking at my practice favorites, I can see my lipid panel. Let's see if I can get that in there. There we go. So now lipid panel's under my favorites. So that's only going to be necessary if you think the providers are really going to have a different list from one provider to the next. So otherwise, the practice level favorites is sufficient, and I think you can add enough tests that way, especially because if you think about it, the lab template doesn't give a provider level list of favorites. They're used to seeing it as the template has been designed. All right, sorry, just checking my chat board really quick. All right, so the rest of your practice preferences, they're not specific to test favorites, but we do have some other sections that are very important. There's this section here that's called your preferred performing entity, and this is going to allow you the option to say, our practice, for example, uses only LabCorp, so I'm going to default LabCorp as my vendor. Or if you have a radiology interface, you can default a vendor for that. If you have multiple vendors, you probably won't do this here unless it's like 90% of the time you use one vendor and then you sometimes have another. But most of the time you're probably going to leave it blank if you have multiple vendors so that the right vendor gets chosen when necessary. You also have some checkboxes up at the top, and the checkboxes start with requisitions. And this is something that I don't think everybody's going to have to use this. The requisitions, the paper form of the order, some of the vendors are still going to require a paper requisition. Some of the vendors are not. No matter what, they're still going to get an electronic order, but sometimes the patient is going to go to the lab to get their blood drawn, so they usually require a requisition, and the patient bring that requisition with them. Sometimes they'll still want you to fax the requisition to them so that they have it on paper. So that kind of depends on the individual vendor and how it's going to go. So 2 things need to happen with those requisitions. We have, first of all, this reports section, and you're going to need to choose your vendor, like LabCorp, And then you're going to need a crystal report to be that requisition. And the crystal reports for LabCorp and Quest are already in the NextGen database. If you have something other than LabCorp or Quest, we have a generic requisition that you can use, but the vendor or the hospital, they may require a specific form. So if that's the case, you might have to get that form created on your own in Crystal Reports, or you might not be able to do it in the system. You might have to do it possibly from just handwriting it. And let me show you really quick. Let me go to my computer. If you want to find the LabCorp or the Quest or the generic reports, you go to your server, which in my case is my C drive. I don't have a server on here. But you're going to go to your NextGen root folder. This is really important to remember, so make sure you write it down. You're going to go to your NextGen root folder. Then you're going to go to your database. That could be prod, that could be test, that could be demo, whichever one you're setting up your interface in to begin with. And you're going to open up your database folder, and you're going to go to a folder called Distributed Reports. And this particular folder contains all crystal reports that we give you in NextGen. So we've got a folder for LabCorp, we have a folder for Quest, and then the generic is going to be under Other. So if I look at LabCorp, you can see that there's one in here called LabCorp eRec, and that's your requisition. Quest also has one called Lab Requisition, also has lab labels. It has particular results, crystal reports that Quest does. It also has Other, where you can find generic e-requisition. So that particular form will work for many vendors that aren't LabCorp or Quest, but they won't work for everybody. Either way, when you find the crystal report that you want, you need to right-click and copy. Then you're going to have to backtrack a couple folders. So we're going to get out of the Distributed Reports folder, and right below it is an EMR folder. And what we're going to do is we're going to place this report in your EMR Reports folder. So that's this one down here. So now that I've opened it, I want to paste. And now I've already done it, but I'll go ahead and replace it. And now I've got my generic requisition in there. So we give it to you in the Distributed Reports because we don't know which one you're going to want to use yet. So you're going to take the ones that you're going to use and put them into your EHR Reports folder. If you can't remember where to put it, it's listed under your Universal Preferences in System Administrator. So if you go to System Administrator, and then to View, and then to Universal Preferences, you'll find it under Reports on the left, and it's a pathway called Reports Path. So this is the place where I just put it. All right, I have a question here. We have two vendors, LabCorp and Meditech. The LabCorp requisition prints perfectly. I copied the LabCorp rec and modified the header to state Meditech as this assists lab. Okay. All right, we'll get there. I'll show you in 1 minute. So the place where I was going next, after you have the report added to your reports folder, you have to go back to Practice Preferences, and you have to link that crystal report by vendor. So LabCorp, you'll go Norton button and add, and you browse to find your LabCorp requisition. So in my case, mine's in the C drive, NextGen root. Then I choose my database folder, and then EMR and reports. So LabCorp eRec is right here. So that creates a pathway. Let me just delete this one because I accidentally added it twice. So it adds a pathway here so that you can locate that crystal report. If you had two vendors, you would need to then choose the next vendor in the list and browse to get that one. So you do Norton button and add again. you go back to your server, to your NextGen root folder, and then to database. And then again, you're going to do EMR, reports, and this time I'll do generic EREC, and that's going to link this one here. So each individual vendor has to be linked to its own individual report that way. So make sure first you have to have it in the right folder, and then you can browse to it. Okay, so, let me show you this one really quick. Under Quest, Quest often needs to have lab labels and a lab requisition. They have two different Crystal reports. So you can actually link as many as you want. I have lab labels and lab requisition here. And what happens is when you go to print it, it just prints both pages. So each page that you see is going to be a separate page when you print. Question on the board. Do you link your requisition and your result report here? The answer to that is just your requisition. Just your requisition and labels. The results reports, you don't link them here because you're going to open them up from a different place in the EHR. Result reports are done usually through the File menu under Reports and then Crystal Reports. So therefore, you don't have to do any file maintenance linking in that case. All right. So the other part for the requisition, once you have it linked here, there's a checkbox that you can print the requisition when the lab order is saved, or unchecked like I have means that you can print the requisition manually. Same is true for radiology orders, so you have a checkbox for both lab and radiology. I actually recommend, I don't think right now it's working when you have it print when the order is saved. So what I recommend doing is keeping it unchecked, and then you'll save and send the order to the interface, and then you'll do manually print it. It's one extra step, but I don't think the other way is working very well, so I think that's what you'll want to do, is keep those boxes unchecked. Your next checkboxes, you've got use NextGen Compendium for new lab orders or for radiology orders. And this means that you're going to bypass the vendor. You're going to still have to choose the vendor, but the providers won't have to worry about the vendor when they're placing the order, or when they're choosing their tests. At some point before the order is placed, somebody has to choose the vendor so that it goes to the right interface, but the providers can use the compendium for new lab orders or new radiology orders. So if you've taken the time to link all of your tests to the NextGen Compendium, you probably will end up using the NextGen Compendium for orders. And then you already know the checkbox to allow providers to maintain test favorites, so you can use that or not here. And also, if you choose to use the medical necessity utility, you can link that here. So you can run medical necessity check when an order is saved. That basically just means that you either run the medical necessity check when you save the order, or potentially you can manually run it using a separate button in the module. So you definitely need to come back into Practice Preferences and check all of these settings. In addition to that, there's a couple other tables that we can talk about. Let's go up here first. The Order Result Notification table. This is a very, very optional table. This is something that we've had for a really long time, and it's now being somewhat replaced by the Workflow Manager from the EHR admin menu. And this particular table, stemming back to what I said earlier, remember how I said results can either go to a task or they can go to a PAQ. And in this case, if you were choosing to do the tasking, you can have the tasks routed to additional users for just certain reasons, like maybe you always want to have somebody's nurse notified when that provider receives results, or maybe that provider's on vacation, so you want to have their results forwarded to somebody else. So the idea is exactly the same as the Workflow Manager, and that came out much after this particular table. So again, you you only use this table for tasking. It does not affect the PAQ. And when you go to create something, it's pretty simple to do it. You're going to give a description for it. So I called this one Dr. Adams Nurse. The system is my LabCorp system. You're going to choose your provider. So in this case, I chose Benjamin Adams. Then you choose your location where Benjamin Adams is placing orders from. And then you have an effective dates option. So in this case, I left my dates blank. No start date, no end date. That means it's always going to be active. If I did choose a start date and an end date, then it would only be activated for those particular dates. Then I went ahead and clicked Add, and you choose an actual user. So I chose Christopher Snyder, but you can choose from any of your users that you have in the system. And so basically what I've said here is that Benjamin Adams places a LabCorp order from the Westside Medical Clinic. Christopher Snyder will get the results along with Dr. Adams. The alternative to that is I did one for Dr. Watson's vacation, and I did effective dates. So we have August 29th to September 2nd. He's going to be out of the office, so we want Dr. Smith and Florence White to be notified. So in that way, that's only going to happen to make sure that they get those tasks during that time frame. Now, if you plan on using the PAQ, I highly recommend using the Workflow Manager instead. And in fact, even for tasking, I think the Workflow Manager is a little bit better. So you don't really have to do this table, but I just want you to know it's there, that you can do it for the tasking purposes. And it's specifically for labs, whereas the the Workflow Manager automatically can do more than just labs. And the next table down is also an optional one called the Order Results Sequences. And what this comes down to, when the results come back to the order module, the tests and the components are listed alphabetically. And many times the providers do not prefer to see the components listed alphabetically. Usually they might be used to seeing them based off of what an individual lab sends them on their printed reports. So if that's the case, if they want them in a different order that's, based off of some other arrangement of the components, they can sequence those in the order results sequence table. The catch to this table is you cannot do any sequences until you've received results from that vendor. So you'll notice in here a list of all of the individual tests, but in order to actually do the components, like if I try to find a CBC in here real quick, we'll go with this one. I've got the components in there. You can see they are not alphabetical, so I've gone ahead and done this one already. But you can rearrange them however you want, but it won't know what components to rearrange until you've already had results return. So, like I said, this is kind of an ongoing process. You'll do this one later, but you will, in the meantime, see all of the tests listed. You just might open one of them up and not see any components for them. Like this one, I guess I've had lots of things returned for everything, but you can see you would not necessarily see components for it. The nice thing is that each individual test that you open will automatically have the components for that test. So this is one that doesn't have them. Let me go to another test that might. I'll do a panel really quick. So here you might find the components. Here's the 4 components for an electrolyte panel. So you can move them over. And then here, once you find your components, you get these arrows so that you can rearrange them. So you can make them whatever order you want to right from here. So again, order results sequences, optional if your providers need to see the components listed in another order. Oops, sorry. But then potentially you're going to have to wait for the results to come back. So that pretty much, there's one other file maintenance section, but that's pretty much all of our file maintenance tables. So again, you just want to focus mostly on the order tests and the AOE answers and questions, and also your practice preferences. That's a very important place too. One last thing I wanted to show you before we move forward, and that's in the payer table. In the payer table, you can access an individual payer, like, let me just pick one of these here, and you can do what we call insurance carve-outs. And basically, the payer table now has an order module tab at the very, very end, and you can choose that payer's preferred performing entity. So back before, when I was saying you can choose preferred performing entity by practice, this is for those of you that have multiple vendors, and you choose the vendor based off of the encounter's payer. So if I have Blue Cross of California for today's encounter, it'll choose Quest Diagnostics as the payer for me automatically, even if I had LabCorp as my practice level. So you can use this to kind of take the guessing game out of things. Let me check my chat message real quick. I see your question here about the holding tank. We haven't discussed the holding tank yet, so we'll get to that later. Okay, so I just wanted to show you here how you can link an individual vendor to a specific payer so that you can have it automatically default that vendor when you go to place an order. And yes, there is a little bit extra setup here because you have to add it for each and every single payer, but it's worth it in the long run because you don't have to have anybody guessing which lab to send things to and stuff like that. So if it's all based on payer, this is definitely the way to go. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move forward from the file maintenance section. So if there are any further questions about file maintenance, please make sure you put those in the chat board so that we can get to them quickly here. And now what I want to do is I want to move forward into talking about the actual order module functionality and how we use it. So I've already opened up my patient. Remember, I've been showing you here and there some things in the order module. But just to recap, it is divided into results and orders. So I'm going to start with the orders process here. That's kind of the first stage of everything, is to place the order. So you actually have to click on the second tab over to get to orders. And remember, again, the first screen that you see is the list of all existing orders for this one patient. So obviously I use this patient a lot to create orders, and you can see if you scroll down they have lots and lots of different tests that have been done. But any given patient could have this long of a test or order list in the future. So in order for me to create a new order, you have to click in the very top left corner, and you're going to click this new button, and you'll probably want to choose the drop-down list so that you can pay attention to whether you're choosing a lab order or a radiology order. Remember, it can support both. Your lab order here is what I chose, and the first screen that opens is down at the very bottom. It tells you it's called Select Tests. And this is the tab where the provider is going to choose the test to be ordered. So you're basically going to want to work your way from the top to the bottom. So at this point, if the provider is able to choose the performing entity, they should. That will really help things. It defaulted LabCorp for me because I had that as my practice's preferred vendor, but you can always change it too. And also, then they're going to need to choose the diagnosis. And the way that the diagnosis is going to work, I think for the easiest use of the diagnosis list, it would be best if they didn't place any order module orders until they've already given the assessment for today's encounter. And that's because this list directly pulls from what's in the patient's diagnosis list. So if they haven't already done the assessment first, they're going to have to take the steps to search for the assessment, and really they're going to end up having to do it twice because they're going to have to search for it here, and then they're going to have to search for it in the assessment itself. So it works in the reverse where it pulls from the assessment, but it does not send it to the assessment. So that's where these buttons start coming into play. The first button is the default, and this is the patient's list of diagnosis codes. It's basically pulling from the diagnosis module, and And you can see there's many check boxes, and you can even scroll over. Now you can check box any ones that you want to choose them for today's order, or you can go through some of these other steps here. This order means anything I've checkboxed for today, I can filter the list to show only those for this order. The other option, where you can search all, is when you don't see a diagnosis for the patient and you can't choose from anything that's not in this list, so you'd have to do a search all and type in your diagnosis. So if I want hyperlipidemia, for example, oh, I can't spell. There we go. So if I wanted this particular code, I'd have to checkbox it, and it'll add it to today's order. But notice it does not show up in this list. This is the patient's list. The one I just searched for does not get added to the patient's diagnosis list. So I'd have to click this order in order to see that particular diagnosis. Plus, when you search all, you're searching for the entire diagnosis library. And if you've ever done this in the templates, you know that this is a fairly cumbersome section. It can be a little bit difficult to find individual diagnosis codes throughout the library. And the templates themselves actually do this part a lot better than the order module does. So that's why it's best if you do the assessment in the templates first, so you don't have to mess with this here. Then you're going to also have some options. Let's see, we'll go back here. You can also do an option where you check today's. So if I added a diagnosis to today's encounter, not only does it show me the full list for this patient, but it might also check box the ones that I've added today. So in this case, I haven't done any other templates in this encounter. So when I click check today's, it doesn't do anything. But if I backtrack and I go to my templates, I can go ahead and add an assessment to today's encounter, and I'll be able to do it that way. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my assessment section. And I'll add an assessment. I'll just pick one of these. So I've added an assessment to today through my templates. Now I can go back to my order, and I can do check today's, and it checkboxed that dysuria that I just chose. So not only did it add it to my patient list, it checkboxed it for me. So it makes it a lot easier in terms of getting the diagnosis codes for this particular order. I'm a big fan of just hitting check today's. You also have an option to check chronic. So anything that has a status of chronic in the module, it'll checkbox those. I happen to have 4, so it checkboxed all of those for me. You can also, again, go back to this order, and you can see what has been chosen for this particular order. You can also, from here, from the patient list, do check all, where it checkboxes everything that the patient has, or you can uncheck all if you made a mistake. And then again, check chronic or check today's. So the last resort would be search all. Everything else is so much easier to have to do, so you don't want to have to do search all here. Now that I have my 4 diagnosis codes chosen, or we'll do 3, now I want to go down and I want to choose my tests. And I don't necessarily, here's my really long practice favorites list, but you don't have to use the practice favorites. You can also do by category, which remember I've got cardiology, family practice, gastro, so I can choose from my categories. But you can also go back to practice if you need to. I've also got LabCorp favorites versus NextGen Compendium. So when I checkbox this checkbox at the right side, it's a different list. My NextGen Compendium has a longer list of favorites than my LabCorp ones do. So now from my favorites list, either again, show favorites or category, I can checkbox the tests that I want to order today. So I can do bilirubin. Oh, that's okay. We won't worry about that. We'll do electrolyte panel. We'll do a lipid panel. And I'll do a CBC. Oh, I guess I don't have it on my favorites. Okay, oh, there it is. So either way, I've placed all of my tests here. And I have some other options. Again, you can filter it out to see what you've done for this order. I can also search all. So if I didn't find what I wanted here, like a TSH, for example, I can click Find and do that. This search all is a lot easier than the diagnosis search all. You just have to type in the test name and you can find it. So I found TSH and added it to this order. You can uncheck all. You can also add the favorites and delete from favorites for these individual tests. So if I added that TSH, I can add it to my practice favorites. You can see TSH in there now. So either way you do it, you ultimately are probably going to want to use the favorites, but the search all is really not that bad here. The difference is, do you want them to use the NextGen compendium or do you want them to use the vendor compendium to find their tests here? If they use the NextGen compendium, it'll be a more familiar list no matter what the vendor is. Otherwise, you're going to be at the mercy of what the vendor calls the test. So if a lipid panel calls it CBC, LabCorp calls it CBC, or Quest calls it complete blood count, they'll have differences in how they find things. So the compendium is often the easier way. Now I've got diagnosis codes and tests, and you can see all of that down at the bottom. All 4 of my tests have been chosen. I also have, I should have 5 actually. There we go. I also have 3 diagnosis codes, and I've applied the diagnosis codes to each and every test. That happens automatically. If certain tests do not belong with certain diagnosis codes, you can uncheck from here too. But typically it's going to just send one separate list of diagnosis codes plus a separate list of tests. It doesn't usually relate them together on the lab side. You also have your check medical necessity option here, and you can run the check manually. So if you need to see if a test is passed or failed, you can do that. And also if you use medical necessity, you can print your ABN form right from here too. So you can print it and have the patient sign it. Delete failed tests mean that if they failed the medical necessity check, you can delete them from the order. You can also just delete tests in general, and you can apply all diagnoses if you haven't already. So this particular tab, the Select Test tab, this is where your provider is going to be focusing their time. They're going to be choosing their diagnosis code and their tests. The other tabs, starting with General, can be done by anybody else in the practice who might have this information. So the first thing, the ordering provider, this is the Encounters rendering provider. The location is the location of service. These 2 things come from your 4-point check as well. So you can just, make sure they're the same person who is actually seeing the patient and for the location where you're seeing the patient. The billing type is chosen here. So the lab will see to bill third party, which would be their insurance. It's a patient billing, so they're going to bill the patient. Client means they're going to bill you, or other might mean there's a different option. You also need to choose the order priority, whether it's routine, callback, stat, timing critical, or ASAP. Order status, this means it's either a new order, you're going to cancel an existing order, you're going to hold an order, which really doesn't mean you're holding it. It's still going to send it to the lab and you're telling them to hold it. Replace means you're changing or you're replacing tests on the original order with different tests. And change is kind of the same thing, but you might not be replacing tests. You might be adding tests or taking tests away, but not replacing them. So these, everything except for new, is usually sent with existing orders. So I've already placed an order, I might have to open it up and do cancel. Or I might have to open it up and do replace or change. New is the one that you, of course, want to do the first time you place the order. Also with cancel, if you look down here, there's a cancel reason. It's just 2 boxes down. And they do usually like you to put a reason why it's going to be canceled, and this is a free text field. We had a question here for the billing type. Can you set any default settings? We currently use a template for lab orders, and the billing type is based on certain criteria defined by the system. Good question. The orders module, the default that you see here, third party, that's all you can do. You cannot change any default settings. The templates, I understand you can do different triggers and things like that, but the order module, it defaults to the first item in the list, and you have to manually choose it if it's something different. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed a couple of questions. I didn't mean to. It was back to the diagnoses here. Are they in a particular order? I don't believe so. I think they're actually just in order of when they were added to the chart, and I actually think that the first ones you see are the more recent ones. And then you also had another question, can IMO be attached to this select diagnosis section? I don't think so. I think IMO only works with our next-gen templates, so I think you're going to have to use your templates for the diagnoses there. Also, there was a question, is there a time frame for canceling a test? Well, in next-gen, the time frame is that the encounter has to still be unlocked. So whatever your unlock or your lock time frame is, you have to cancel it within that. But your lab might have a time frame all their own. But once the encounter's locked, you cannot modify it, so you cannot actually send a cancel. So that's, I guess, the best thing to go off of.
How to write in the dates? Is month first though?
All right, so you've also got a specimen action code. And this actually means if you obtain the specimen, you might say if it's a new specimen. Here's the option if the lab does obtain the specimen from the patient, but you might have something else like it's a pending order. You haven't sent the specimen to the lab yet. It could be even all the way down at the bottom. You're adding tests to an existing specimen that they already have. So these are for specifically those of you that collect the specimen or what you're doing with the specimen. It defaults to new, by the way, because it's oftentimes going to be a new specimen. You also have a free text box here where you can send clinical information to the lab. This option allows you to CC providers, and all this does is it sends the provider's information to the lab. It doesn't actually send anything to the providers, but the lab will get the provider's name and address, and I think even fax number, so that they can send them the results along with you. This can be their primary care provider, it can be a specialist you're referring to, it can be any other associated providers, so you can automatically do that. This particular patient has associated providers from the EPM side, so that's why I added those two automatically. Otherwise, if you don't do the associated providers option, you can do just the provider search, and you can find the provider here by last name or whatever process you choose, and you can add them here. So you just double click their name and then they go. You've also got questions or comments, I should say, and they can be based on general information, patient information, or order information, and all of these are free text as well. And then here's where you can choose the payer. This particular piece, if the encounter has already had the payer assigned, you don't have to do anything here. I created this encounter in EHR, so I didn't assign any insurances. But if they had, meaning they had chosen Blue Cross of California for today's visit, it would show under the selected side, and you'd have a checkbox to have that information listed. You can modify it for this order, so if their encounter is going to be paid by Blue Cross, but their tests are by Medicare, I guess if that ever happens, you can modify it, and it does not affect the encounter level insurance. But vice versa, if they choose the encounter level insurance before you create the order, then it will automatically include that here. So your user shouldn't have to mess with this unless there's some type of a change. So again, this general order information, the provider could do this, but it could also be a nurse or a lab tech doing this. Then you're going to also want to go over to the third tab, which is for test details. And this is different from the general. This is about the order, but the test details are about each individual test. And I had 5 individual tests that needed to be completed here. So I have to fill out information for each of the 5. So what you want to do is you want to click on the individual test. Sorry about that error I keep getting, but you click on the individual test, and everything you fill out on this screen pertains to that test. Then when you're done, you go to your next, and your next, and your next. The top half of the screen is going to list the test, the scheduled date, and test comments. The scheduled date means you're going to send a date to the lab of when this test will be performed. So if it's not being done today, it's being scheduled for Friday, then they can go ahead and put that time frame in. If it's today, they can put today, or they can leave it blank and it actually defaults today. You can also type in test comments, which are free text, so they can say anything they want about an individual test. And then the middle section is the specimen information. And sometimes each individual test will have different specimen information, and sometimes they'll have all the same specimen information. And let's see, down below is the Ask It Order Entry Questions section. So depending on the test itself, they may or may not have Ask It Order Entry questions. And if I click on one, like electrolyte panel, there are no questions down at the bottom. But if I click on lipid panel, I do have questions. So that's why you also have to click on each test so that you can see the ones that have questions. Again, that's all dependent on the lab. They tell you which tests have questions and what those questions are. So you may very well have orders that don't have any questions, and sometimes you might have all of your tests that have questions. So let me go back to the specimen information really quick. If the specimen information for the first test is the same for all the tests, then you fill it out, and I'll just put in something in here. 4 milliliters, collection date was today. You can put in the source site. You can put in the body site if that's necessary. You can do, so let me do here, left arm. You can do site modifier, specimen roll, if there is any additives added to the specimen, if there are, is there a specific collection method used, if there's specific storage information. So whatever the case may be, you fill in the specimen information for the first test, but it applies to all the tests in the order. You can checkbox this right here, and it says apply the specimen details to all tests, so you do not have to fill it out for the rest of the tests. You might notice if you click on them, now it carries forward. So you'll see that there. If you don't have this checked and you click on the individual test, it should actually, probably because of the order I did it in, but it'll clear out for each test, so you can actually fill it out for each one. So that'll be dependent on the individual order and if you are using the same specimen for every single test. Then, of course, the Ask It Order Entry questions are done here. This one, blood lead county, this is a pick list. So when I click in this list, I get my possible answers, which I created in file maintenance. Collection method is also a pick list. I've just randomly chosen questions, so you can choose those. LNP is not, so you can type in answers here. Is patient fasting, yes or no? So you just put in your answers as they need to. Again, if they have particular templates that they pull from, sometimes you might already see certain questions already answered. In fact, bilirubin was one where I had it linked, but I had it linked to a template that I don't have in my database anymore. So it's giving me an error here saying that they can't find that particular template. So once you've completed the test details, that's the last of all the steps. Now you're ready to actually place the order and send it to the vendor. So at this point, there are 4 buttons down at the bottom. The one that sends it to the vendor is this one that's called Save and Send. This one, if you hover, it even says, click to save changes made thus far to send it to the performing entity and close this form. That's the only button that sends it to the vendor. Save and Task saves your changes, but you can send a task to any of your work groups. So that's what I have here are all my individual work groups. Save and Print. means you're not going to send it to the performing entity, but you are going to print a requisition. And then save just means they're going to save your changes so far and close the screen that you see. So in terms of workflow, each individual person, depending on their piece of the order, they may click Save and Task. They might just do Save, but you don't want to do Save and Send or Save and Print until you're done. Save and Send, again, sends it to the vendor. If you have to send it to the vendor and print a requisition at the same time, I recommend doing Save and Send first, and then coming out here where your order has now been saved, it's the top one in the list, and click the print button right up above it. And here, I'll do this one so you can see the requisition. So if you save and send, it goes to the vendor, and now you can just print a requisition. Because it is kind of difficult. That's the part I was saying. It doesn't really work because the buttons are separated to either print or send to the vendor. It didn't have one for both. So here's a LabCorp requisition and what it looks like. This is what you can actually print and send to the vendor. And LabCorp, by the way, has the labels down at the very bottom. Quest has labels in a separate page, and I think the generic one is on a separate page too. Now, also when you're placing your order, there's going to be a couple other things in this list that's really important to know. First column is your order number. This is an automatic number that gets created with every single order that gets placed. This number gets sent to the lab. So it's a really, really important number to have. They're going to send the order number back when they send you the results. Therefore, they're going to have, that's how it's going to kind of identify which results go to which order. Okay. Also, you're going to have the next-gen status and the result status. Next-gen status is either going to be ordered, canceled, assigned, or signed off. So if it's ordered, that means you've sent it to the vendor. If it's canceled, of course you canceled it. Assigned means that results have come back for this order. And signed off means results have come back and you've signed off on those results. So sometimes you'll see ordered, sometimes you'll see assigned. That just depends on what stage that order is at. The result status, it's typically going to be sent or final. Mine say pending because I do not have an interface. So all of mine say pending because it hasn't actually gone anywhere. In fact, if you go into your order here and you click Save and Task or Save, but you don't click Save and Send, that also makes it say pending. So pending means it hasn't yet gone to the interface. Once it has gone to the interface, it says sent. And when they've received results, you usually see final. Sometimes you might also see preliminary or partial or something like that, and that's when they've sent you preliminary results. But otherwise, final is when you've received all the final results for that test. And then it lists the ordering provider. It'll list the tests that you've ordered. It'll do your location. All the way over, you can see who signed off and when. So in this one, I've signed off on it yesterday, or not yesterday, but on Friday. So you can see all of that information as needed there. At the top of the list, of course, you know about creating a new order, but you also can refresh the list. If anything changes as you're looking at the list, you can refresh, especially statuses. You can sign off on any tests that have a status of assigned. So this one says assigned and final. I can click sign off, and it'll now change the status to signed off, and it'll put today's date and my name. If you try to sign off on something that's not assigned, it'll tell you you can't do it. It says results have not yet been received, basically. Also, by the way, with the sign off, we'll go through this in a minute, but your sign off can also be done through the PAQ, and it'll automatically sign off on orders here as well. So you don't have to do the sign off option from here. This is just an alternative. You also can update an existing order, but that's going to depend on whether the encounter is locked If I click update on today's encounter, then I can open it up and I can make changes as needed. But if I go to an older encounter and try to update it, these encounters are locked. So first of all my save buttons are gone, and it says encounter for this order is locked and none of your updates will be saved. So you definitely have to do it before it locks. You can cancel a test from here or cancel an order from here. You don't actually have to open it up and choose cancel, but it does require that you choose cancel reason. And then of course you can cancel order and send it to the vendor. You can delete an order, which if I deleted one or if I've canceled one, I might want to delete it. So you can get those out of the list. Or you can delete an existing order that you haven't canceled, but it won't tell your vendor that you've deleted it. You have to send a cancellation notice first if you're going to delete it, if it's actually been sent. And then of course there's print, which prints exactly what we've set up in file maintenance. It doesn't print anything else. And you can also filter your orders. And right now the filter for the order list is going to show you lab versus radiology and a date range. So if I want to see only orders that have been placed in the last month, then I can click OK and I can see that these are my orders that I've done in the month of July. If I want to turn off the filter, then you just click cancel and it brings you back to your full list. So right now you can only narrow down your order list by a couple of things. I have a question on the chat. If result is workflowed instead of PAQ'd, I guess tasked instead of gone to the PAQ, I assume the provider must sign off in the order module results tab. Yeah, that is definitely what you can assume there. If you task the results, you can't sign off from the tasks. And technically speaking, when you go to, here's a task here, if you go to the chart from here, it takes you to the order module. So I would say if you do receive tasks for the results, click this sign off button. If you don't receive tasks and you send it to the PAQ, then that's of course the place where you want to sign off. Another question, we can see the paperclip. Oh, okay, we'll get to paperclip in 1 second. The paperclip is an attachment to the order, so that's the one you're talking about down here. A couple of mine have paperclips on them, so we'll get to that. There's also, some of them have these little post-it notes on them too. So there's a couple of icons that are determined by the results. Before we go on to the result side of things, are there any more questions about placing orders? And I'll give you a chance to type that in. Okay. So while I'm waiting for that, we'll go ahead and start talking about the results side of things. And of course, in terms of your interface, pretty much everybody should have the results coming back across the interface. You may not always have orders going across your interface, but everybody does have results. And the results themselves are sent from the lab, and if everything goes correctly, those results are going to come automatically back into the patient's chart, and they're going to populate the orders module in a couple of places. And so therefore you're going to see the results tab, which is the first screen you see when you get to the order module. This is the main way that you can view the results. First off, it lists the name of the test and the components. So the name of the test is in gray. The components are all down here underneath it. And you can scroll down alphabetically to see all the individual tests. Then it's also going to show you date by date. So I have tests that were done on 7/29, 6/10, 6/1, 5/24. So it starts at the most recent date and it works its way out. And you can of course scroll over to see those tests as well. So it creates kind of this grid format for you. Once you can see the results, you can actually click on an individual test as well, or an individual result as well. So in this CBC, I clicked on the hematocrit, and from right here, from 5/24/11, and it loads the information down below. So I can see the result is 30, the result status is final. I can see that it was considered a low result because the normal range is 34 to 50. And then this one didn't have any comments on it. So again, clicking on the individual result will give you some more detail about it. Some of these you're going to notice colors. Blue tests are low. Sometimes you'll also notice bold. Sometimes it's in bold blue. Where are those? Here's one. So this one's in bold blue. So that's actually a double L in terms of the flag. It's really low. And in this one, the same test, hematocrit, is 34 to 50 for normal, and this one is a 16, so it's considered to be really low. If it's in red, like some of these are, then those are high. And it also has the same alternative. If it's bold red, then it's really high. Here's a bold red. So either way you do it, you're going to see colors for high and low. Normal is black. And let's see, you'll also sometimes see pink. Pink is there for the tests that aren't really a high or a low situation. It's kind of just more of a positive or negative, abnormal or normal. There's not really a range for it. So you'll see pink in there too for abnormal. And also sometimes you'll notice that certain tests or results might be underlined. Like here's one, it's red and it's underlined. The underline means it has comments from the lab. So if you look down below, you can see the comments here. It said LDL cholesterol calculated is not valid when the triglyceride is greater than 400. So whatever that means, that's the comment from the lab. Here's another one that's underlined, so you can see those results or those comments. Here's another one. So those all come from the lab. You can't change them or add to them. They came directly from the lab itself. And then the other thing that you'll see are sometimes the results are shaded gray. So you can see this PSA screen way back here is shaded gray. That means that this test has preliminary results. The value you're seeing there, the 0.2, that's probably the final. As long as the final results have come back, you'll see the final results there. And in fact, when you click on it, I can see the status says final. But what this tells me is that there are preliminary results. So in the top of the screen down here, you can see results history, and I can see preliminary results too. So it was a 0.2 to begin with, and final results are a 0.2, but I can see the preliminary results that way. And so again, you have to notice if one has shaded gray. All of these, in fact, right here are shaded gray, so all of these have preliminary results. So if you look at them, you can do that drop-down list. If they don't have preliminary results, like some of these, the drop-down list is blank. All right, question on the board. Our providers are asking if we can set the abnormal results at the top of the list. Is that possible? No, it's not here. You cannot filter anything in this list technically, or you can filter it, but you cannot default it. It's technically going to be listed by the name of the test first, and then the date, and it's always going to be alphabetical by test. There is a filter option at the very top, and they can filter when they want to just see abnormal. They can do it by test name, by result name, or by the flags, or even by a date range. So, for example, if they just want to see anything that's abnormal or high, they can check box abnormal and high, click OK, and it'll filter to seeing only red and pink. So that'll kind of help a little bit, but you really can't change the view of this list. It's also nice, too, when you want to just find one test, like electrolyte panel. I can type in that test, click OK, and then it just filtered to that one test. And I only had it on 2 different dates, so it showed me those as well. Same with the filter. So if you wanted to see an individual component down here, like, I don't know, white blood cells or something, you can click that, type that, and click Add Result down here, and click OK, and it'll filter to showing me any test with white blood cell count in there. And date range is good too. Sometimes it gets so far back you might just want to see results from the last month, for example, or maybe 2 months, and you can filter it down. I only have one test that's been resulted in the last 2 months. The PAQ, we'll talk about that in 1 second. You can somewhat change it. I mean, you're not really going to change it by the flag, but you can see the results by high, normal, and low, and so you can kind of filter that way. I'll show you that, though. It'll make more sense in a minute. Now, with your results, too, you can also refresh in this screen, and this is important if results have come back for this patient since you've been looking at the screen. You can refresh. Also, you can do a graph for individual results, and it's only going to work if it's a numeric value, and it's also going to work best if there's more than one test result. Like this one for platelets has more than one, so if I do a graph, it plots all 3 times this test has been done. But if I find one maybe down below that doesn't have more than one, it'll, oops, that one was the wrong one. See, it plotted the individual one, but it didn't, there wasn't anything else to plot, so it wasn't really very specific. And then you might have already noticed, if you click on something that's not numeric, like this one up here is negative, if you click on that and try to graph it, it tells you no data available to plot, and that just means it doesn't have information that's graphable. The graphs themselves, you can't really print them. They're really just to look at them, just to quickly see. This one, for example, their levels have changed and gone up. So it's just kind of a quick look. I think I just answered that question on the chat board. So yeah, you cannot print these. You can't right-click or do anything like that. You can print graphs if you go to the File menu, and then you do a graph from here. You can choose Order Results this way. And let's say I wanted to graph, I'll do that same one that I just did, that hematocrit. So I can create a graph out of that. Here is all my hematocrit here. There's a printer button in this. So that would be, you'd have to manually do the graph from the File menu if you wanted to print it. Okay, so this, like I said, this is the main results view. This is what we call a flow sheet. So you're going to see the test and the date here, but you can also look at the results in a couple other places on the Order tab of the Order module. In fact, when you click on an individual order, if they have received results for that order, like one of these that says assigned, then you can go down further in the window and you can see there's a results section. You can expand that and you can see those results. Let me get back to my chat board real quick. Oh, I got it. Okay. So basically here, if a test has received results, like we'll do this one, you can see a couple of options for these. We have first a tab called Formatted Results, and it's hard to see it in this half-screen view, but you can see here it lists test by test, individual component and results, and it gives you comments and things like that. This is a way that you can, instead of seeing the results by the actual test, you're seeing the results for an entire order. And what's nice about this thing is at the top you notice the buttons. You can click on full screen, and you can see a full screen document for it. So this is something that is sometimes a little bit easier to read, but it's also something that you can print, and you can give this to the patient, or you can fax it to somebody, and it's in a nice readable format. So full screen is just an easier way to see it, but you can also do the print and everything from not being in full screen. Sorry, let me get my WebEx out of the way. And you can also set up what we call critical range alerts. And you might have noticed on some of them, when I click on a test or a result that has a critical range alert set up, you see this little pop-up window right here. And this one was a hemoglobin A1C where the result was 8, so it was out of range. Here I have another one. The result was 11.6, so it's out of range. And you can set this up for whatever you want. So let's do it for this test. I'm going to click Setup. and then you choose your component. So we'll do the bilirubin. I have no idea. We'll just do one of these. And when you choose your component, you're going to choose add to the right, and you want to choose the gender that this result might pertain to, or this alert, the age that the alert would pertain to, and then the critical range. This is the value where it's normal. So if the value is normal from 50 to 100, which I'm just making it up, then anything outside of 50 to 100 will produce this alert. And then the prompt is what you want to say. This result is out of range, for example, or you can type in instructions on what to do or comments of some kind, but it's whatever you want to say when that result is out of range, and then it adds that to that particular result. So then if you come across any tests that have that component, which I don't think this one does, but then you can go ahead and get that alert pop up just like this does. Those alerts are set up here under the formatted results, and they're only viewable from the formatted results. So you don't really want to spend a lot of time setting them up if you're going to be viewing results from here. Now down at the bottom also you can view things by grid results, and it's a little bit different look. Like, for example, instead of seeing everything on one page, I can click test by test. So here I'm seeing the TSH results. I can click to see lipid panel. I can click, let me make this screen a little bigger. I can see urinalysis. I can see CMP. So it's kind of scrolling through, but it's taking me to that test for what I need to see. This one should have expanded a little bit better, but it didn't. And also what you can do from the grid results is you can delete if you need to. So if this particular result needed to be deleted, I can do that here. Oh, this encounter's locked, so I can't do that. But on occasion, you'll find that sometimes labs send results to the wrong patient. They have human error just like you guys might, so it might go to the wrong chart. If that's the case, you can use the grid results to delete either the panel or the individual result, if that's the case. And then, of course, you contact the lab to tell them to resend it to the right patient. Down at the bottom again, you also can do, I'm going to skip a tab really quick, and you can do a new results entry. And this might be the reason why you have in-house labs. So remember when I was showing you how to create the hemoglobin A1C in-house? And I showed you to create the hemoglobin A1C test, and then you're going to create the hemoglobin A1C component. And the reason you do that is so that when you go to manually result, right here, down at the bottom under new results entry, the component key, the component, the unit, and the range are already completed for you. If you didn't do that in file maintenance, you'd have to complete these already right here. So now I can put the result in, and like I could say, for example, it's a 6. That falls in between 0 to 7. So my flag is N for normal. Observation date was today. And then if there were any comments, you can put that in too. But basically, this allows you to manually result your tests. Of course, if you have an interface, you're not going to manually result, but anything else that you want to do, you can do that here. And once you've inputted your results, you do want to click Save, and it'll save your results, and it'll also automatically show your results in all the other formats as well. So let me get that to save real quick. You'll also be able to see it over here. So you'll be able to see it in this format. Let me go to hemoglobin A1C real quick. So there you go. It had results from earlier. I cannot remember what day I ordered that test. I guess it could have been farther back because it was a 6. But it'll show the results in there. Maybe I need to refresh. There we go. So it's from 610 that one was in there. So also, that was, I guess, really the way that you can describe that best is that the formatted results, the grid results, and the new results entry are for labs. The other two tabs for documents and images and new documents and images, those are mostly for radiology, but they can be done for labs as well. And that's where the paperclip comes into play. So you can see this paperclip next to this order right here. That means it has an attached document or image. And when you have a particular order, you can attach any document or image you want. The actual document and image, when you do a new one, you can browse the file system on your computer, which means you can add any text type of a document or a Word document or an image or, a PDF, anything like that. So here's just some random things that you can see in here. You can attach whatever you want to add, and you can see that it's letting me browse for lots of different file types. And you can even see and hear all the supported file types. So you can attach any type of document. I've got a sample document that I use in here, and it's a Word document. And when you attach that particular image or document, then it's also going to ask you to route it to a category. So not only are you attaching it to an order, you're going to put it into your category list. So if this one were for a lab result, I would put it in my lab result category, and then you give it a description, which we might say, I don't know, lipid panel, or how about results? I'll just call it something simple, results. And then you click OK, and it's going to attach this document to this order. Now you have to go a step further because you have to click this link button, and that's actually going to officially attach the information. That's also what makes the paperclip show up. So when you do that, you can either do browse file system, or you can search for EHR documents, and you can do it, and then you link them. So therefore you get the paperclip, and it's now viewable under documents and images, the middle tab. And this is my actual document here. It's just something I quickly typed up. But you can see it's now attached to that individual test, and I can view it here. I can also click on my history toolbar, go to categories, and remember I attached it to lab results. I called it results, so I can see it right here from 8/1/2011. So I can see that document there too. It can also be routed to the PAQ as well. So it's really just a way for you to attach documents and images. It's the reason why I say it's mostly for radiology is because that's how a radiology result comes back. Even if you have an interface, a radiology result is a document. If you do have a radiology interface, though, you don't have to do this step. They automatically import. But if you don't have a radiology interface and you still want to do your radiology orders here, an option for you is to attach your document when the results come back. However, the other option for you is to scan it in through ICS. So you certainly don't have to do the attached documents and images entry. Sorry, I missed a couple questions. Are the critical ranges per provider? No, they're not per provider. And in fact, let me test this really quick. I think they might be for everybody, but I'm going to check to see if they're per user. So let me go ahead and go to my formatted results for this. Yeah, they are per user. Oh no, those don't have results. Let me see down here. Okay, yeah, they're per. Oh, never mind, I'm crazy. They're actually for everybody, for you to be able to do that. So they're not per provider. And then let me get to your other question that I missed. I'm sorry. Oh, if there's pathology results, I guess that all depends on your interface and how pathology results come back. They can populate the results just like labs can, but usually that'll just depend on how your interface is. It might have to talk to the lab and how they do it too, because it could come back as a document, I guess. I'm not 100% sure on how pathology results return. All right, so that's how results are viewed from the bottom. They are in, let me move that out of the way. They are in either the first tab or under results through formatted results, grid results, or you can do new results. And then remember, you can attach documents and images. So that's pretty much how you use the order module there. What I do want to also show you before we go on to the Rosetta holding tank is if you receive results through task, let me switch users to a different one real quick. You'll get a task for that user. And I've done results today, so you can see there's a couple of results that have come through. And the task itself just tells you there's new results for this test. So if you go to the chart, it takes you to the chart, and you can go to the order module. So it doesn't really give you much other information, but you can at least look up the results in here. Your alternative is to have it set up to go to the PAQ. And when they do go to the PAQ, they look a little bit nicer. You can actually see the results here. Here are the two results that have been done today. And you can see the results have come back. Here's one for a lot of results. And you can look through them and see them right from the PAQ without having to go into the module. You can also task directly from the PAQ if you need to, and you can sign off from here. And it will sign off in the module as well, so you don't have to just automatically do it in the PAQ and then go to the module. And now the filtering part, you can't really filter it by abnormal, but you can filter it by description. So if I click this description part, I can group all of my orders together. So I see all of my high orders, all of my normal, here's some very highs. So they at least list them by different names. So that would be a way that you can group them. But that doesn't necessarily mean they'll go to the top or the bottom. It just means that you're seeing them grouped together. So it's not really a filtering kind of process. But I do recommend the PAQ as your result sign-off. I also recommend using a template called the Provider Test Action Template to document any action taken about results. This is kind of like the telephone call template, and you should have learned about it in your core group training, but this particular template is good for documenting if you need the patient to schedule an appointment about their results, or if you need to change their medications or refer them to somebody. These are all the actions you might take when you receive somebody's results. And so therefore, the reason why this comes up with PAQ is that we also recommend, if you use the PAQ for your results, we also recommend you go to Options and you create a custom rule, like I have here, that anytime you accept any orders, you launch your Provider Test Action Template in a new encounter. So that way, as soon as you click Accept, it takes you over to your Provider Test Action Template, and you can document what you discussed with the patient, or even if you didn't discuss anything and they were just normal. So that's pretty much it for the order module. For the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the Rosetta holding tank. But if you do have any other questions about order module, you can still send them in the chat board, or you can also email them at the end of the session too. But I do want to move ahead to the Rosetta holding tank. And before I go into it, I want to point out the Rosetta holding tank is on your application launcher. And what this application does for us is it specifically deals with your results. And I don't know if you remember, but when we first started talking about results, I mentioned if everything goes correctly, your results should return back to the order module for you automatically. But things don't always go correctly. Basically, when you send an order, you are sending an order number and a person number. And when the lab returns the results, they're returning that order number and person number. And every single order has one, but it's up to the lab to send those two numbers back. And if they forget a number, or if they incorrectly input a number, then it can't match to a lab result or to a lab order in your encounter or in your chart. So what happens is it falls into this Rosetta holding tank when it has not matched to an individual order. So somebody at the practice needs to be monitoring the Rosetta holding tank all the time, every single day, to make sure results that come here can get matched to go to a chart. So again, if they're here, they have not yet gone to a chart, so providers don't know about them, they haven't gone to a PAQ, nothing like that, so they're invisible at this point. So it's very, very important that you make sure you go to the Rosetta holding tank at least once a day, and that you have the proper people who would be responsible for matching the results come in here. And that could be more than one person too. So basically what you're seeing here in my list are all of my unmatched lab results. It can include documents too, So you'll see sometimes I have that in there, but we'll mostly just talk about labs in this case. But if anything did not match, your job is to come in here and match it. There are a few different ways that you can match the items, and all the while I want you to keep in mind order number and person number. It has to have one of those two. It has to have both of those to match. So first option is the auto match, which is this button here with kind of the circle and the colors. You can go to auto match and you can create options. And the options I've already done, but you can create levels to use these individual options. And remember again, if it matches by order number and person number, it won't be here. But let's say instead of person number, you can match the order number and the social security number. So that might be one rule. Also, you could try order number, and then I have date of birth and patient name. So it has to match to all three, and then it'll match. Level 3, I did order number, date of birth, and phone number. And level 4, I just did order number and patient name. So basically, the more rules you create, the better, because you're giving it more options. But if you notice this column over here, it's kind of towards the end of my list, and it says NG order number. If you notice that all of your returned Rosetta Holding Tank items have an order number, and they're just missing a person number, then you can probably use those auto match options very well. If it's the opposite and you see a person number but not an order number, then the auto match will not work. Because if you notice, in my options here, I cannot actually uncheck order number. It's required to have an order number. So it depends on how it comes back and what's missing, but you can try the auto match rules. Also, you can use these buttons. You can match manually, and you can do demographics, location, provider, and order. And if it's a document, you can also match the category too, and that's for radiology orders. So when you manually match, what you're looking for is you highlight the individual order, and then you look down at the bottom of the screen. And everything that's listed in red is an unmatch. So any one of these might have different things unmatched. Sometimes you'll see things in black, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it matched, but it might mean that there was no information inputted. So they never even put in a provider, so therefore there's nothing to match. But what your job is to take every individual section and match it. So demographics, provider, location, and order. Or if it's document, instead of order, it's a category. So in order for me to match these, I just click the corresponding button. So if the demographics are red, then I click Match Demographics. And then it's going to bring up a patient lookup, and you can read the patient down here. Like you can type in the last name Jones, and you can match them. Now, I don't happen to have this exact patient, but you can pick the patient to match it to. Because I have a lot of orders, I'm going to pick a different patient. But whoever you choose in the list, it will match it to. So first things first, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just click OK real quick. Actually, let me match it to a different person. So when you actually match the demographics, it turns it green. So your goal overall is to turn it from red to green. But what I want to show you here is that the system will let you match it to somebody totally different. So they gave me T. Jones, and I did Penny Copper. So you can make a mistake. That's an important point to remember. You can accidentally pick the wrong patient here, and it doesn't catch you. So you always want to double-check your work, and you want to make sure that the patient's name matches, the date of birth matches, sex, and if you do social security number, make sure that matches. Then you work your way down, and you're going to do provider next. So you can click Match Provider, and you'll choose the provider who placed this order. This one's important so that it goes to the right PAQ. So I matched it. Location is next, and this is my location of service. And it matched that. And then this one automatically matched the order when I was matching the patient because I only had one outstanding order. But I can also click the Match Order button. But right now, what I see is that every single item that was red is now green. So everything is matched. It also makes the row in the list this light blue color. So when you unselect it, you can see it's highlighted blue. And so that means it's either partially matched or all the way matched. I had a question on the board. Can you pick multiple results to match to one order, especially when you have a panel come back? It can be very time consuming. I don't think so. It's going to come back as the individual item that the lab sends. So eventually, as you're matching, you can do it to multiple orders. To multiple results to one order. But you're going to have to do it line item by line item no matter what. So you're not going to be able to click control or anything and match to one thing. You're going to have to do it all together. So now that I've matched everything green, what I want to do here is go up to this commit button, and I want to commit my selected item. So I'll commit that row. It's going to process the message in Rosetta, and what we hope to see is that it was successful. That means it will successfully process to the EHR, and it'll no longer appear in the Rosetta holding tank. So when I click close, it went away. It took away T. Jones. And now the results have gone back to EHR. So I might have a new task. I might have a new PAQ item, which I do right here. So it just depends on how you have your results routed, but it'll automatically go back, and it'll go to the chart and things like that. So once you match it from the holding tank, it's as if there wasn't an issue at all. It automatically goes back in the way it should have been. Now sometimes, let me show you match results, or match order. Sometimes it's much quicker to just match the order. I went through demographics, provider, and location, but if all four of them have unmatched, it's easier to just go to match order because it'll actually match everything at once. So you click the entry in the list, and then you click match order, and you'll always select lab order 1 from the list. It just means you're going to look up the order. And you can search by order number, by person number, you can search by patient name. If you were given the order number over here, you can look that up, and then it'll automatically look up the patient that it goes to. In my case, I wasn't given either person number or order number, so I might have to look up last name because I at least have that. And I can find all the orders for this patient. I can choose the one. In fact, you might even also want to scroll through to see what was on here. So now CMP and CBC and stuff like that. So I might want to match based off of the test. Here's one, for example, with the CBC, so I can choose that. And then it automatically matched the order, the location, the provider, and the demographics based off of one order. So it made it a lot easier to do that. The only time you don't want to choose match order is if it's just one item that's missing. Like they might have just missed the provider, or they might have missed the location. Then just click the button that corresponds with that to make it easier. But if it's everything unmatched, click match order and it'll go faster. Also, it'll make sure you don't have as much room for error, because if you choose the right order to begin with, you know you have the right demographics, provider, and location. And again, once you've matched everything, you've turned it all green, you go to commit, commit selected, and you reprocess the one you just did. And you do want to see that it says successful. If it says, let me show you here, let me match two things. I'll match the provider, and I'll match the location real quick. So I've matched some things. There's 2 things in green, 2 things in red. If I try to commit this now, it's going to reprocess it, but it's not going to be successful. It's actually put it under hold. And hold means I haven't finished it. So instead of it sending it back to the chart, it sent it back to the Rosetta holding tank. And I get this message under description that says reprocessed by holding tank, failed to match patient. So it caught the error. I didn't match everything and it caught it for me. So your job again is to go through every single line item and match them to the chart every single day to make sure that everything gets completed. In this case, since I only halfway matched it, let's say I made a mistake, you can do revert and you can reduce or revert your changes. So it took away my 2 green match options. Refresh is a good idea too, because labs are sending results all the time, and as you're working in the Rosetta holding tank, you might want to refresh to see if anything new has come in. And like I said, it really is a goal to make sure you clear out this Rosetta holding tank every single day. Delete. This is an option if a result comes back incorrectly, the wrong patient, or it came back by mistake. You can delete it, but there's no other reason to delete it. You want to match it before you delete it, because if you delete it, it won't get matched. It'll never go to a patient's chart. And then the final options that you have over here on the left, you can filter by an individual column. Maybe if you do documents and labs, you want to filter by the type. And for example, you only want to see lab results, or you only want to see documents. Maybe you want to filter and work on things by an individual provider, and you have providers in this column. You can filter there. You can filter by descriptions. You can filter by date. So it depends on however you want to get through this list, but you can filter. And when you're done with the filter, you can clear it and then uncheck the filter button, and it'll take it away. And then you also have the orphaned view, and the orphaned view means that they're separate from the Rosetta holding tank. It actually means that instead of having gone to the Rosetta holding tank and it was just missing order number and person number, the orphaned records are also missing enterprise and practice. So if you have multiple practices in your group, this is really important, because the actual Rosetta holding tank that you see is a practice-specific list. So if an orphaned result comes in and it doesn't have a practice or an enterprise, then it's not going to go to anybody's holding tank. So you can actually checkbox an individual item, and you can do what it says up top. You take ownership of the orphaned records. So if I checkbox this and click OK, I'm claiming it to my Rosetta holding tank. It doesn't mean anything about matching. It just means I'm putting it into my holding tank. And you can scroll through and you can look at it, and you can see, for example, the provider, so you'll know if it's for your practice or not, or location. Other things, maybe like if there's an order number in there, you can look up that order number in your system and you can see if that was an order that you placed. So scrolling through this list, it'll tell you if it's your patient or not, but you only want to checkbox and click OK if it's your result to match. If it's not, you need to wait for another practice to do it. So if you are multiple practices, you need to have a process decided where either an enterprise level person does this orphaned record option, or each practice does it, but they're careful to only take ownership of their records. If you're only one practice, you still might get orphaned records, but it's much easier for you. You just checkbox all of them and click OK, because they automatically go to your holding tank no matter what. Somebody asked if there's any reporting functions for the holding tank. There are not. We do not have any reporting functions. There probably could be crystal reports created, but we don't have any at this time. All right, so that's it for the Rosetta holding tank. So again, if there are any other questions about that, let me know. I will be sending out the documentation again, and it does include a document on the Rosetta holding tank. So again, if you haven't told me already to include you on those documents, give me your email address in the chat board, and I will do that for you. And our last topic that I want to do today is another application that came out with 5.6 SP1, and it's called the Orders Management Console. Before we actually log into it, I want to show you that you might have to go to System Administrator, and you might have to go to the Edit menu and go to Full App Launcher Access, and you might have to add the Order Management Console here. It's not automatically turned on to your application launcher when you upgrade to 5.6 SP1, so you may have to go in and do that. And again, it's only if you have SP1. And the purpose of the Order Management Console is if you use LabCorp. So if you're not currently using LabCorp, this will not, at this time, function for you. But what's happened is LabCorp has provided us their test compendium, their Ask It Order entry questions, and their information that goes along with all of their tests. And you can download all of the LabCorp information into your file maintenance tables automatically. If you don't have LabCorp, you can still use the Order Management Console to download the most recent NextGen compendium. So it'll at least give you something there, but it won't have your vendor. So I've already logged in, and what I want to show you here is there's two different places you're going to want to go. First, you're going to want to go to Settings. So the first time you log in, the Settings button is down at the bottom of the screen. And Settings here, you will automatically have this server URL. It automatically connects to the NextGen server that contains the compendium for LabCorp, or for NextGen compendium. But what you're going to need to do is create a folder to download into this directory. And the folder itself it needs to be on your server, and it needs to be a shared folder. And that gives you this in the example, on your server and shared. But you can create that folder yourself and browse to it if you want to. And then you're going to see available lab systems. LabCorp is the only one. So you move it over from the left to the right, and then you're going to map it to your system within NextGen. So it says LabCorp on the left. You choose LabCorp from the drop-down. At some point, I believe Quest will be part of this, but it isn't right now. And then after that, it depends on other vendors and if they get us their compendium list. Now, once you have your settings, you save it. And what you're going to do is you're going to download all of your options. So you can download the NextGen compendium. You can download what we call the LOINC compendium, which is a components list of universal codes. And then I can download my LabCorp. So you choose it in order. You do have to go NextGen, then LOINC, then LabCorp. But each one you're going to select it from the list. And then you click download at the bottom right corner. And so in this case, I'm downloading the NextGen compendium. It's going to automatically pull it in for me. And it's going to give me my NextGen tests. If it's a green plus sign, it's a new test. If it's a red X, you see at the top, it's deleted. If it's shaded yellow, that means it conflicts with something that's already in my database, but there's nothing, but I can change it. I can pick which one I want. If it's shaded blue, then it conflicts with my database, but I have to take what's new. So this one's shaded blue. That means it actually has a different name. NextGen description was blue. So in my database, I might already have this test, but the name is changed. So I have to take the new name. If it had been shaded yellow, then I could pick between the two names. I can also use this to automatically insert whether it's a confidential test. I can checkbox some of these. And I can put a user description in. So you can kind of edit your file maintenance tables on the fly too. So not only are you downloading, you're editing at the same time. And then when you save it, it processes here. So I got 368 new records, 3 differences. Going to save it, and it's going to upload to my file maintenance tables now. Then what it did is it moved on and it added to the favorites list. This is, if you look on the left, it did the NextGen compendium first, and now it's doing the NextGen compendium favorites. And I only have 4 in here because I have a test server, but if I click that I want to save this, it'll download these 4 into a favorites list. You can also skip the favorites because not everybody does favorites. So you can skip that. Once you're done with your NextGen compendium, it'll show you the date that you last downloaded it. The LOINC, I haven't downloaded it recently, but there is an update available, so it's telling me that. So I'm going to download that next. And this one takes it a little bit longer because there's a whole lot of components out there. But it'll download the data the same way as the NextGen compendium. And the NextGen and the LOINC compendiums are pretty basic. You're just downloading a universal list, and there's not a whole lot to it. But if you have LabCorp, you're not only downloading the compendium, but it'll automatically link the NextGen compendium to the LabCorp. It'll also put in CPT codes for at least some of the tests, and it'll do the Ask It Order Entry questions, and it'll link the Ask It Order Entry questions. So it does a lot for you. So I definitely, if you have LabCorp, I recommend doing this if you haven't already. So I'm going to let this finish importing really quick. Then we'll pull it up. And LOINC is just going to be the compendium. There's no other favorites. Oops, I got an error on this one. That's okay. We'll go on to LabCorp because LOINC is not that important anyway. So I'm going to download my LabCorp list, and it's going to go in a specific order, but it's going to start with ask it order entry answers, and it already downloaded them. I already had them all. So it skipped on down to ask it order entry questions. Here's a new question where it's saying the weight. It puts the code. It does the description. This one is now being done as answer required, and it linked it to a NextGen template automatically. Vital signs, adult, weight in pounds. And then it has now ask question once. If I had done this for the very first time, I would have seen about 15 different questions and the answers. So the very first time you see it, you're going to get all of that stuff in there. Remember, if it's a plus sign, it's new. A red X is deleted. Anything shaded yellow means it's different from what I already have in my database, but I can change it. So if I highlight over this or hover, it says the answer required answer changed from no to yes. And this one, ask question once, changed from no to yes. If it's shaded blue, which nothing is, that means I don't get to choose between the two. I have to just go with what it's given me. So then again, I'm going to save this list. And I'm going to move on down. It's going to do my components. This one didn't have any new components. So it's going to do order tests next, which is my whole entire LabCorp compendium. I had one new test to add to my list, but I had a bunch that are already there with some changes. Here's CPT codes that are being added. Some of them might have ask it order entry questions. Here's one. Is patient fasting? It'll automatically attach that ask it order entry question to the BMP. Some of them might have specimen details, and some of them might have components. I don't see any specimens or components, but again, I'm using a sample database. Oh, here's a good one. Blood lead has a couple of questions in it. So again, it downloaded in order so that it could properly link. So we had to download the NextGen compendium first, and it'll link the LabCorp codes together. I had to download ask it order entry answers first, so it could link those to the questions. Then I had to download the questions so I could link to the codes. But like I said, it also does CPT codes and specimen and stuff like that. So it does a lot of your file maintenance setup for you. And I'm going to use some of these as an example. I'll do this plasma glucose 001818. I'll look that one up in my database so that you can see that it's downloading and attaching that question. So now you can see that I have this. Anything that I can edit, I can modify from in here. I can't really edit that much, but I could do the cost, for example. I cannot edit the CPT code or the questions because those come from LabCorp, but you can see that. I'm going to save it again. It's going to go ahead and do that. That's okay. And then it'll go on down to favorites. And again, you can download LabCorp's preferred favorites, or you can skip the favorites. But basically what's happened now is it has downloaded, let me exit here, it has downloaded everything into file maintenance for me. So if I look at my order test table, hopefully it worked because I got an error message, but if I look at that one test I was talking about, oh, it didn't even add it for me. But if I do my BMP, I know that one was one of them. Oops. Let's see, it's basic. There it is. See, it automatically linked my code. It automatically linked a CPT code for it, which is probably just an example one. And then it automatically put in my ask it order entry questions and my components. I've never looked up this test before or done anything to it. This all came from the order management console. And documentation, by the way, on the order management console is on nextgen.com. It's not in my email. It's on nextgen.com in the current order module user guide. So you can look it up there. But I do want to stress again, outside of the actual NextGen compendium, it's only going to work for LabCorp. So some of you can do it for the NextGen compendium, some of you just for LabCorp. But otherwise, its job is to populate the NextGen test compendium, the order test table, and it'll link the two together. It'll download AOE answers and AOE questions, and it'll link these to your tests, and it'll do your CPT codes. Oh, and it'll also do your order test favorites. So it took care of the majority of your file maintenance setup right there. And if you don't have the order management console, some of this stuff, like the order tests and the next-gen compendium, can be done through your interface analyst, but you'll have to link them together manually, and you'll have to do ask and order entry questions manually. All right, so I don't see any other questions on the board. I guess we'll go ahead and stop here. This is about the end of our topics here, but if you do have any other questions, you can also put them on the chat board now, or you can also email them to me. And like I said, if you did not get the documentation from me earlier, before today, you can let me know on the chat board to attach your email, and I will send it to you. I do have one person's already. So if that's it, let me check my chat board one more time. Oh, somebody asked here if I can demonstrate how the template interfaces to the order module. Yeah, I have time to do that. So, technically speaking, the 7.9 KBM already has triggers and stored procedures that are configured. If you were lower than 7.9, you have to do the triggers for that. But the templates that connect with the order module are from the SOAP template or any other specialty. If you go to your plan template, you can basically choose either from My Plan, Labs, or Diagnostics. And I'll just do Labs since I've got everything there. But what you're going to do is you're going to check box the tests that you want. Like, let me do a lipid panel because I know I have that one. And I'll do a BMP. So I check box the test that I want, and you click Place Order. But you're going to want to go to this order module processing down here. Place order has just done it in terms of the template. When you click order module processing, then you're prompted with a screen here where you can choose the type of order, whether it's lab or radiology, and then you choose your vendor. And then you move your test from the top grid to the bottom grid so that you can create an order. So I'm going to move my BMP down to the bottom. I'll move my lipid panel down to the bottom. And it's basically behind the scenes linked those tests from the next-gen compendium and also identified them in the LabCorp compendium so that when I click Process Submit, it's going to create a LabCorp order. Oops, let me get rid of BMP real quick because that one I think is causing the error. So we'll do lipid panel. I'll process, and once it leaves this bottom grid, it's created an orders module order. So, in fact, let me quit this really quick so you can see my order. If you go to the orders module now, you will see a new order for a lipid panel that came in just now. So, the templates are configured if you use the order module processing. However, it only does the select tests tab. Somebody still has to come here and do general and test details. And it doesn't send it over the interface from the template because you still have to do general and test details. So the provider can use the templates, but somebody else is probably going to do the order module processing, and then they're going to access the order from here. But in terms of the provider using it, from this point of view, doing it from the lab template, it's very, very easy. Also, if you do it from the lab template, it automatically puts it in the documentation from the grid down at the bottom of the template. It also, if you double-click one of the orders, you can submit to SuperBill from here. The order module itself does not do any billing for tests, so if you have to bill from your practice for those tests, you want to do the template. But either way, there's still a component in the orders module. You still have to go in there. And again, if you don't have the 7.9 KBM, you do want to attend the lab template development webinar. All right, so I don't see any other questions. If there are other questions, please put them on the chat board now, specifically about the templates. Otherwise, we can go ahead and stop here. Okay, question on here, when results return, does it change the status in the template? The answer to that is no. The template itself, let me show you, it has a status of ordered. When results come back from your interface, it doesn't affect your template at all. It's a completely separate piece of it. It only changes it from your order module. I think we'll go ahead and stop here. And if you do have any other questions that come up, please send them to me over email. I'm happy to help that way. And I guess I'll let everybody go, and I'll be sending the email out if you requested that. And I'll talk to you guys later. Thank you.
My phone came on. You gotta go to
your
the
caca?
came on?
No.
You gotta go to the store.
What the hell you did to the damn phone? Okay, ma'am.